All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. First of all, good morning and welcome to this panel discussion called Know Your Steps. My name is Seth Brown. I'm one of the pastors here at Imago Dei Church, and I also work for the Baptist newspaper for North Carolina called the Biblical Recorder. To my left, I've got Dan Darling, Vice President for Communications at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission for the Southern Baptist Convention. And to his left, Jay Watts, President of Merely Human Ministries. I appreciate you guys being here with us today. So, if you have watched the news recently, you've probably seen some big headlines about abortion and related issues. It's a controversial topic that comes up often, work, school, dinner table. We hope this conversation will help to equip you to engage these issues well. And specifically, we want to kind of tackle some common myths and misconceptions about the pro-life movement and about abortion in particular. Now, if you're here, you are probably already passionate about pro-life issues. We understand that. We understand that we're kind of speaking to the choir. And so that's one of the reasons we want to drill down and talk about some very practical, street-level, daily conversation kind of topics and questions. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump right in. In public discourse, abortion is commonly described as a women's health issue. Jay, I'm going to toss this first question to you. Do you think it's accurate to say that abortion is merely a women's health issue?
Yeah, what the other side means when they categorize this as a women's health issue, what they're doing, and it's what I was taught by Greg Kokel and Scott Klusdorf, and what I've experienced is about 98% of the time you're talking to people, is they're assuming that the unborn are not human in the same way that you and I are, that they're operating at either no value or greatly diminished value in comparison to more mature human beings. And by doing this, then what they're doing is saying that a woman has no more need to get our approval from the state or interference from the state or the community in her right to have access to an abortion than she would to have access to a tooth extraction. It is just no moral component to it whatsoever. It's her body, it's her choice. And this just completely dismisses the idea that the unborn have any value whatsoever. Now, we often say when we're trying to train people to be able to discuss this, that if the unborn are not human, then, or if the preborn are not human in the same way that you and I are, then what they're saying is correct. But they haven't actually answered the question. The single question that is most important in dealing with the morality of abortion, whether abortion is good or bad, evil or what it is how we answer the question, what is the preborn? And that's exactly what they haven't done when they assume that it's not that. And this question isn't a question that's objectively answered. And what I mean by saying it's objectively answered, I mean that how you feel about it, your emotional state towards the preborn is of no interest whatsoever into how we answer this question. Your emotional condition, your state, your personal subjective preference view, whether you wish you were pregnant or not, whether you want her to have the baby or not, none of these have anything to do with what is the preborn human. They are something independent of how we feel about them or what we think about them. And so our job to determine the right or wrong of the act of abortion is as best we can to find the best answer to the question, what is the preborn human? And that's how I train people to argue. Now, there's a lot of different ways to discuss abortion. There's legal ways to discuss it, emotional and spiritual. But in this particular case, we're talking specifically about the moral case against abortion. And we argue, what I argue and what I train people to argue is that we argue from two categories. We answer the question, what is the preborn human life, by first looking at the science of embryology that tells us that it is whole, distinct, and living human being from the moment it comes into existence. It is whole, not a part of anything else, distinct, it is different from any cell of the body of its mother and its father, and it is living. It meets every criteria necessary to be considered alive, whole, distinct, and living from the moment it comes into existence. And then we use philosophy to argue that human beings have value, that human beings matter, that when we have this intuition that we commonly share, when we see something going on to other human beings. I like to talk right now about the famine in Yemen. We see what's happening to people starving to death in Yemen. And we say, that's wrong. That should not happen. No human being ought to have to endure that. And when we look at any culture like Syria, what happened in the war-torn parts of Syria and Aleppo, or when you saw that child laying face down on a beach, and we say that should never happen to a human being, we're appealing to a universal idea of universal human dignity, universal human rights, universal human value. All human beings have value no matter what culture they live in and no matter where they live in the world. And no matter where they are, no matter how old they are. And so the best explanation for that experience is that the grounding for our value is in our identity as human beings. Not what other people think about us, not our age, like Stephen Schwartz gives what he calls the SLED acronym. Differences of size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency. None of those things do the philosophical work necessary to explain why I could kill you when you were younger, but I can't kill you now. And so when we're talking about that question and objectively answering it, when somebody says that as a man, which I hear a lot when I go to speak to university campuses and I give a presentation, I always open up the floor for Q&A so that everybody has a chance to come after me. And one of the first questions I get is, what makes you think as a man that you have the right to talk about this issue? And what I tell them is, if the unborn have no value, if the preborn human life has no value, then you're right, this is a personal matter. But if they are human in the same way that you and I are, and we have the same basic duties and obligations to them that we have to any other human being, not the least of which is just to not kill them, then the question of what are we doing by killing tens of millions of human beings every year around the world through the practice of abortion is a deeply important moral issue that all of us have the right to speak into. And if you dismiss my arguments from science and philosophy because I'm a man, you are making the mistake of an ad hominem attack. You're attacking me, to the man, not the arguments that I've made. You must deal with the science. You must deal with the philosophy. If we're arguing in theology, you must deal with the theology, but you can't dismiss the arguer. You can't say, because I don't like you, I won't listen to you or consider your arguments. That's not how arguments work. Arguments are valid or invalid. They are true or false. They are sound or unsound, but they are not male or female. The science and the philosophy are what we must engage. And if the science and philosophy tell us that they're like us in morally important ways, then abortion is wrong.
I would add to that and say exactly what Jay is saying, that it really boils down to, is the preborn life a human being, or is there a human being there? And if there is, that's where it has to start. And I do think we can do this in addition to the arguments that Jay recommends and I commend, is when you're talking to people, even appealing to their own sense of humanity, their own sense that the preborn life is human. And instinctively, as a society, we get this. I mean, just listen to the way that people across the spectrum, whether left, right, or in the middle, talk about unborn life when you're not talking about abortion, right? So whenever there's a celebrity that is pregnant, all the news headlines will talk about the baby, right? And not even really think about it, right? Beyonce, a couple years ago, she was pregnant with twins, put an Instagram post about her babies, right? So she humanized the babies. Some of them even go so far to name them beforehand, right? What is that? That's assigning humanity to that preborn baby. So I think appealing to people's sense that there's something there. Whenever someone has a miscarriage, we rightly mourn because there's a loss here. And even some of the more honest feminists have admitted that there is something going on here. There's a death of something here. Even Anthony Kennedy said this in his unfortunate ruling on Casey, that there's a tragic death going on here of some kind. And so appealing to people's sense that there's life here. And we're the ones saying, hey, if this is a human life, are they not worthy of protection? Are they not worthy of respect and dignity?
So pregnancy obviously affects women in ways that it does not affect men, physically, to be specific. Some may say that presents an undue burden on women. Dan, do you think the availability of abortion creates more equality for women in society?
I mean, that's the argument that the pro-choice movement will make, right? That we are alleviating a burden to you. And this is all based on a sort of Darwinian premise that that the flourishing of one group of people is an obstacle to the flourishing of another, right? And abortion is not the only arena this has been used, right? If you think of the arguments in the 1800s about slavery, the argument essentially is the flourishing of this group of people is an obstacle to the flourishing of these group of people. Sometimes you hear it in other arguments, even when we're talking about things like that are controversial and complex, like immigration. Sometimes I'll hear people say the flourishing of these people is an impediment to the flourishing of these people, and that's just a sort of Darwinian argument that is really not an argument for dignity. And we're saying, and sort of the creation story, the narrative through Scripture is that we can all flourish together. That more people, we can all flourish together. We don't need to press this group of vulnerable people down in order for us to rise. And so women can flourish, and they don't have to destroy unborn human life to flourish. I think they can flourish together.
Yeah, that's great. And I'd like to add two things to that from the position of engaging people also. Number one, it makes the first mistake I talked about. We talked about that. It assumes the inhumanity of the unborn. The way that a tool that you can use to check for this is anytime that anybody tells you a reason that abortion ought to be legal, we ask ourselves this question: would they offer this justification if we were talking about killing a 2-year-old child? If the answer is no, then they have assumed that there's something different between the 2-year-old child and the preborn child, but they don't get to assume it. They have to argue for it. They have to explain the differences between the two. And so if they say, if they're making the argument that equality in the marketplace for women abortion is necessary to establish equality in the marketplace for women. Women need access to abortion. Well, you would never argue that women need access to the ability to kill their 2-year-old children for equality in the marketplace, and we would never accept that as a community as an argument for justification for killing 2-year-olds. But if that's true, then that means we've assumed that there is something different between the 2-year-old and the preborn child. But we don't get to assume it. We have to argue for it. The second thing is I think it undermines the very idea of equality of women. The idea of arguing for the equality of women is that women have talents and abilities and can compete equally on a fair ground against men in the marketplace of ideas or capitalism, whatever. Wherever you place them, that women are equal to men and ought to have equal access and equal share to the possibility of thriving and flourishing, and using the terms that Dan was talking about. The problem is this argument for abortion assumes that women are not equal to men unless they have the right to kill their unborn child, their preborn offspring. So they need access to a medical procedure in order to be equal to men. This isn't an argument for women's equality. It's an argument for a kind of qualified equality. Sure, we're equal to men as long as we can do this. Without our ability to do this, then we're not equal to men. And we mentioned earlier, too, one of the things I find frustrating about this is that as a father of 2 beautiful and brilliant young ladies, as a friend to many beautiful and brilliant women in my life, those women can do all of the things that they set their minds to doing, and they can do that even as mothers if that's what they choose to do. Now, sometimes they make different choices. For example, my sister-in-law, who is a brilliant woman who graduated with an engineering degree from Georgia Tech, helped start and found a business, sold her shares in that business because the thing that she wanted to be great at was being a mother to her children. And she wanted to use all of that ability and all of that talent to be the best mother that she could be. So the idea that this is an argument that fights from the position of equality of women is nonsense. It actually undermines the equality of women by saying that they have to have access to a surgical procedure, while at the same time assuming that the unborn are not human in the same way that you and I are.
That's just a great argument, and I could not have put it any better. The other thing to think about when you think about the equality of women is the abortion industry actually does the opposite. And what it does is it enshrines this systemic injustice against women, whereby men are enabled to have essentially consequence-free sex. So the abortion industry allows men to sort of have relationships without any consequence, because the babies are removed from that, right? And so actually this enables men in many ways to be predators, to be irresponsible. It removes the sort of communal aspect of what happens when a husband and wife come together and have children, or man and wife come together and have children. It's a communal thing. It actually leaves women alone and bereft of any sort of help with this new life. And so I think this is why I'm always a little bit turned off by men who are so vocally pro-choice. I want to say to them, what is your motive here? What are you trying to do here? You're keeping in place this systemic injustice that really, I think, hurts women.
So abortion is often described or presented to us as this no-hassle outpatient procedure, pop in, pop out, problem solved. I would love to hear both of you guys talk, either from research or your experience in ministry, speaking with women. How does abortion affect women emotionally, physically, spiritually after the event?
I mean, just talking to post-abortive women, which I'm sure many of you have in your work, you'll know that it's not despite the way that the pro-choice movement portrays it, it's not just an easy, consequence-free decision that people soon get over. It's something that, in my experience, talking to post-abortive women, that they've had to live with for the rest of their lives, a sort of a real weight on their conscience, sense of guilt and shame over what they know instinctively is a moral decision. This is where I think the church is really important to come in and say the church is the exact place where people who feel shame and guilt of their sin can come and find hope and restoration in the cross of Jesus, that Jesus bore our shame, he bore the guilt, he bore our sin. And all of us, essentially, regardless of what kind of sins we've committed, we all come to the cross with shame and guilt that Jesus bore, and we can have that sort of freedom once we meet Jesus. And so I think this is why our pro-life conversations have to be coupled with the good news of the gospel, that we're not just saying this is wrong. It is. But we're saying there's a better way in Christ, and there's freedom and hope in Christ.
Yeah, absolutely. There's like two ways that I'd like to address this quickly. The first one is just from the statistical side, the idea of the medical procedures. Women still do die from perforated uteruses through the practice of abortion, even though it's legal. It's not like, even when you're just taking the pill, okay, like RU-46, there's this idea, well, I just walk in, I take a pill. If you've seen the movie Unplanned, you've seen a graphic demonstration of why that's not true, what actually happens to women. And oftentimes, the way it's given to them is they're given the pill at the office by somebody, and then they're told to go home or go to if they're in a hotel, go back to the hotel, and this will happen. And it's very isolating. So it's not even just like they're going through something terrible with the pain of the induced cramps that have been put through after they have had taken the pill to destroy the life of their preborn child, but there's also the isolating nature of it. They're just left alone. Go and do this on your own, and it's horrifying. And so you have all of these things that are still there. We also have the question of when we talk about like safe, legal, and rare abortions, who are we talking about it safe for? Obviously, every abortion is lethal and destructive by its very definition for the unborn child. If the preborn child's human, there's no such thing as a safe abortion. Abortion by its very nature is destruction of human life. And then finally, if we're talking about as a Christian, and when I argue, you'll hear that I don't talk about my faith a lot while I'm arguing, but I'm personally, passionately a Christian man. And if the Christian worldview is true, which I believe it to be, and that the best explanation of the world that we live in is the truth of Christianity, then what you're actively arguing to people throughout our entire culture as we argue for this idea of consequences-free sex or through abortion and all these other things, is that sin will have no impact on your life. And we know this just isn't true. As the anecdotal information that Dan was sharing a second ago, well, I have also I remember talking to a friend of mine in Illinois who I've worked with on several events, and she was an atheist when she got, and worked for Planned Parenthood when she got her abortion, and she struggled with this for years about how she felt. And she said, I went to counselor and talked to them, and all of them said, well, you have perfectly right to do it. You had every right to do it. They affirmed her right to get the abortion. She said, and still she felt no better. And then finally she sat across from a counselor, and she told her story about what had happened to her. And she said, that counselor looked at me, and she said, well, what you did was wrong. and then the counselor started to talk, and she said that hearing those terms, what you did was wrong, suddenly made sense of everything that she was going through. The idea that she had done something wrong explained why she was hurting, why she was in pain. All the people that thought they were helping her by affirming her were actually hurting her because she couldn't explain why she felt all of those things. And that was the thing that's wrong, because you feel anything at all. And it's not just her that all of a sudden had clarity or explanation. It's men that I've met who sit across the table from me and say, every year on the anniversary of the day that my girlfriend got an abortion, I feel deep pain and remorse and depression because I was the one that helped that happen as the father of that child. I abdicated my responsibility to that child and sent my wife into this. And so all throughout culture, if the Christian worldview is true, we should see this reverberation of denying the idea that this is a sin is causing pain and hurt and confusing us. And not just that, we become callous towards life. Once we've made that argument that it's okay to kill these people, this class of human beings, we have opened ourselves up to the idea that it's okay now to hurt others and to include others into the category of those that it's okay to destroy life. It always grows. The list always grows once we start down this path. And so it hurts women physically sometimes. It always hurts them emotionally, and it hurts us all as a community when we embrace this idea that sin is not sin, but a right.
Yeah, so as many women's care workers will attest, whether at Human Coalition or elsewhere, parents who have determined to abort often find themselves in very difficult and heartbreaking situations that are leading them down this path. Jay, could you speak to how should we think about issues like rape or fetal abnormalities?
When we're addressing rape, what I like to help people understand is that we have to recognize the moral evil of rape. The worst times I've ever seen this answered by well-meaning Christians or well-meaning pro-life advocates is when somebody brings up rape and they immediately want to start to defend the unborn child without any recognition that a great evil has happened to another human being. A woman has been victimized in about the worst way that she could, short of being killed. And for many of them, actually, they'll tell you that it was worse. It would have been worse than dying. And so we have to recognize the evil of rape. But what that also does is it sets us up into a place where we can have a conversation about this that brings us clarity. Because when other people perform acts of evil against other human beings, oftentimes when we ask questions like, what's the good thing that we can do here? That question ceases to make sense any longer. What's the question is, what's the best that we can do with the terrible situation that we've been confronted with? And as Christopher Kaiser, a Catholic philosopher, says, sometimes because of the evil actions of others, we are left with only two choices: the morally heroic or the morally reprehensible or condemnable. The evil actions of someone else has taken away the middle ground option. All that we have left is to ask of some other human being the morally heroic or to give them permission to do that which is morally condemnable. And so in this particular case, what we have to do is make the case that even though we recognize that the evil of rape has put a terrible burden on another human being, that we as a community are going to come alongside them and help them to make the life-affirming choice and to recognize that this is not their fault that this has happened to them. And so it's our responsibility to help them to carry this burden as much as we possibly can. Now, one thing I will tell you is that instinctively people know this. When I was at UNC Chapel Hill and I was talking to a group of people, I'd given a presentation and then I interacted with the student body at UNC for 4 hours. And after they were not doing very well arguing with me for about 3 hours, a bunch of them started yelling at me about rape. And they felt really good about themselves at this point because they know they have something that makes me uncomfortable. Well, rape makes me uncomfortable because rape is a terrible thing and it's hard for anybody to answer or talk about. And so I said, okay, I hear you, and I addressed the evil of rape, and then I put my hand on my hip. This is a tool we call Trot Out the Toddler. I put my hand on my hip, and I said, I have a 2-year-old little girl standing next to me. I want you to imagine that every day her mother at some point of the day looks at this 2-year-old little girl, and she remembers the worst thing that ever happened to her. She remembers the worst moment of her life. And not all day, but at some point every day, she struggles with profound depression and the memory of that. I asked all of those people yelling at me, would it be okay with all of you if I killed this 2-year-old little girl to relieve her mother of the remainder of that terrible event? When all of them got very quiet and said, of course not. So I asked this question, why? Why can't you kill her? It will help the mom. It might help her. It might help her overcome this. And they said, well, you can't do that. Why can't you do that? Because you can't kill human beings because they remind us of something terrible. I said, I agree. So if the preborn child is human in the same way this 2-year-old little girl is, then we can't kill them because they remind us of something terrible. The argument that we have to make is, what is the preborn child? Determining that they're a human being puts us in the family of obligations and duties to them. And you said yourself that we can't kill human beings because they remind us of something terrible. We have to figure out what's the best we can do with the bad situation we were confronted with. And as a Christian and as a man and as a human being, the most life-affirming choice is the best one.
So Dan, continuing this thought of parents finding themselves in difficult situations, how should we think about issues like poverty and health care as it relates to abortion?
I do think we do need to think about these things as pro-life advocates. When I was talking last night with Amber about some of the data and the research that Human Coalition has access to, it does seem an overwhelming percentage of women in crisis who come to pregnancy resource centers, and those of you that are involved in women's health clinics like this, you probably know this, but an overwhelming percentage come for economic reasons. They're abortion-minded because they just don't know how am I going to make this work. I don't have any safety net. I don't have any support system here. And I do think we have to think about these issues when we think holistically about communities, that what are the factors that lead women to have abortions? And how can we help alleviate those, whether through economic policies or even just through the way that in our churches, the way that we come alongside the most vulnerable. And one of the great things that all of you do on the ground in these centers is just connecting, making the case to these young women that, hey, you can do this. The pro-choice industry is telling them, hey, listen, you can't do this. There's no economic way for it to happen. And they have, the pro-choice industry has an economic incentive to do that. And we have to come along and say, hey, actually you can. We'll connect you with the community, preferably the church, that can help you raise this child. We'll point you to a number of resources. We can help come alongside you. I do think this is a very important thing for us to consider. But at the end of the day, when you're making the moral argument, one of the things when I often talk to people about this, and this is the thing that they bring up, they'll say, you folks that are pro-life advocates, you care about the preborn up until the time of birth, and then you don't care about children anymore. I think that's unfair, because when I look across the landscape, the pro-life landscape, these are the very same people who are sponsoring children, who are giving their money away, who are going to help children in crisis. But number one, I think we should listen to some of that and say, oh, okay, how can we as a community support children all the way through their lives? But at the end of the day, the least compassionate thing to do for a child is to kill it, right? So don't ever think that you're not compassionate because you want a child to live, right? So making an argument that, well, a child's going to grow up in poverty, so we might as well just kill that child. That's the least compassionate option, right? I mean, it's a strange way to care for a child's poverty by killing the child, right? And so I don't think that argument really we should fear.
Let me add, I know we didn't cover this earlier, but I would like to add, in light of what he's saying as well, I think you bring up a great point, because it imagines that our happiness is in some way also tied to our financial prosperity, which simply isn't true. I can say that just from my own life. I mean, my kids will tell you that some of the happiest times in our lives have been some of the times where we were financially struggling and we were forced to find free stuff to do, right? Like the park is free, so let's just go to the park. And I've actually talked to a family one time who they were struggling when they were younger, and as a single mother, and their kids were very young, and by the time her son was graduating from high school, they were financially doing very well. And she shared with me that her son told her, do you remember when we were poor, when I was younger? And her mom said, well, of course. His mom said, of course I remember that. And she said, her son looked at her and said, that was great. So, that was, I remember that. That was just a great time. And so we have to come against this idea. I've gotten to travel all over the world and meet, and I know you have too. You get to meet people in villages that have nothing compared to like the things that we have. And they're some of the happiest people I've ever met. They have no idea they're supposed to be miserable because they don't have all the stuff we have. And so I think coming against that as well, this idea that prosperity equals happiness.
Well, and to use your argument, if I suddenly lost my job and we were in economic distress, should I kill one of my children because we can't afford them? How about children who grow up in developing countries that I've visited that are in enormously heartbreaking circumstances and areas that we as the church should come alongside and help? Should we kill those children because they're in poverty? No, we should come alongside and help them with resources. So the least compassionate thing to do for an impoverished child is always, always, always to not let that child live. And so the pro-choice movement does not have the upper hand even in that argument.
That's a great point.
So Roe v. Wade, a Supreme Court decision from 1973 that legalized abortion nationwide, has been and continues to be one of the primary topics of discussion in the pro-life movement. Jay, could you speak to, theoretically tomorrow, if Roe v. Wade was overturned, what happens after that?
Yeah, there's a common misconception out there when I talk to people that if Roe v. Wade ends, suddenly abortion is illegal throughout the United States, and that's simply not the case. What Roe v. Wade did, what the court did with Roe v. Wade and Doe versus Bolton back in 1973 was that they looked at the landscape of what they saw happening, and they saw the liberalization of abortion laws across the country. That's what they claimed to have seen. And they said, look, this is the direction things are going, so let's just head this off at the pass right now. Let's make a decision that ties the hands of all the different state legislatures across the country. There's going to be a uniform way of addressing this, and that way we're going to not have to argue about this. We're not going to spend the next 30 years arguing about this. Obviously, that was a colossal failure. What they did was start one of the most massive arguments in the history of the United States because they tried to circumvent the will of the people and not allow everybody to reflect on it. So what happens if Roe v. Wade goes away is that it all goes back to the states. Is that we're no longer disallowed by the federal government to have this argument on a state level. From my position, from what I do for a living, I travel around the United States and the world, and I equip audiences to be able to have conversations about this issue that are productive, that are impacting. And let me tell you something. If that happens, if Roe v. Wade goes away, for those of you who do not like to have to argue about this issue, I got bad news for you. You now have to argue about this issue with the people in your community, because for the first time in my lifetime since I was 2 years old, we will have the ability to impact the laws of our community on the issue of abortion by convincing my neighbor that it's wrong. By not forcing him to follow some particular area or another, but by having the opportunity to stand in front of the people in my community, look them eye to eye, and to be able to make a case for the value of human life. And to say that the preborn child ought to have the same rights as far as just the same basic duty and obligation to them that we have to other human beings, the least of which is just to not kill them, to refrain from killing them. And if we have the opportunity now to make a case with our neighbor on that particular thing, that's where the landscape goes. It empowers us to be able to change our communities with our arguments. And so if Roe v. Wade goes away, then it's your responsibility, everyone in this room, to equip themselves to go into their community now and make the case, because for the first time since 1973, we can make a huge difference on the laws of our community.
By the way, Jay, I just did some math in my head to figure out how old you were. Jay's exactly right. And first of all, Roe versus Wade is probably one of the worst decisions that the Supreme Court has handed down. Even people who are pro-choice have looked at the legal arguments and said that they're just very convoluted. I'm not that optimistic that Roe is going to be overturned, although I hope it is. And if it is, we'd all be doing cartwheels. Even the Baptists would be doing cartwheels. What I think is more likely to happen is a case from 1992 called Casey. Would be chipped away at. And what Casey did was talk about viability. And I think what's more likely to happen with a more conservative court is some of the state level laws in more conservative states will be allowed to stand, the 20-week bans, heartbeat bills and things like that. But Jay is exactly right. If Roe was overturned tomorrow, that's not the end of the pro-life movement, it's the beginning, because then it obviously goes back to the states. And what you're seeing right now is actually an acknowledgement by both sides that there's a chance it could happen with a more conservative-leaning court. And states are passing what's called trigger laws, both conservative and liberal states. So conservative states are passing laws that say if Roe is overturned, that triggers in our state a ban on abortion. And liberal states like New York, that's essentially what the New York law was, that if Roe is overturned, then abortion will be legal. So then we're going to have to go state by state and make state by state arguments, which I think are very important. But I think on a more philosophical sense, I do think we need to think of ourselves in terms of we are champions for life and human dignity. So if we only think, well, if pro-life, if abortion is outlawed in the United States, then our work is finished. Now look, if abortion was outlawed, that'd be amazing. I mean, I pray for that day. But in a fallen world, in every generation, there are always going to be groups of vulnerable people that are going to be targeted for assault, right? So if it's not the unborn or the preborn, it'll be another group of people. If we only think of ourselves as advocates for the preborn, then we will miss other assaults on the dignity of other vulnerable populations when those arise. And so I think we need to think of ourselves as always champions for life and human dignity.
And to that end, there are, according to the World Health, depending on what stats you're reading, somewhere between 41, according to the World Health Organization, 56 million abortions worldwide every year. But 1 million of them only are happening in the United States. Now, that means that, as Dan was talking about, we're not just pro-life advocates in the idea that all we care about is this particular issue, but we care about the value of all human beings, that all human beings ought to be treated with dignity and respect. As Christians, we also have to recognize that if abortion did somehow end in the United States, then it's not over. There's still a whole world where it's happening, and we have to find some way to take what worked here and apply it elsewhere. I had the opportunity to speak in Great Britain last year in London, and to meet with advocates in a growing, there'd been no pro-life movement in London at all for the last 40 plus years, and suddenly one is growing now in England, and as these advocates are getting their feet under them and figuring out what to do, we go over there and we talk to them about what has worked here and what we've done. And you should hear them tell you how grateful they are, how much encouragement they get. We actually saw the same thing happen in China. A friend of mine went over there many, many years ago. A friend of mine who had started a lot of women's clinics around the country in the United States went to visit his daughter who was a missionary in China. When he was there, a Chinese pastor and he were talking. That Chinese pastor said, I'm going to get more pastors to come and talk to you. And he talked to them. He said, I'm going to get more pastors. He said, I went there to visit my daughter. I spent 2 weeks talking to, by the end of it, thousands of Chinese pastors. And these pastors have taken that and now they're doing what they do in their country. We're all a part of one giant force for life. And just because it stops within our borders wouldn't mean it stops. Now we have to go and see what we can do to help other people. And you see the same thing for us when we look at other countries that are standing their ground on this issue. We tell them, we're encouraged by what you're doing, as they're encouraged by what we're doing. And when we see loss in other countries, we contact those people and say, keep your head up, keep in the fight. Don't let today's discouragement become a loss over we still got work to do. So Dan is absolutely right. It just never ends for those people who think that all human beings ought to be treated with dignity and respect.
So we've got about 4 minutes left. I would love to hear you guys just address our posture and our tone as we speak to people that we disagree with on this issue.
So are you saying we're the only ones keeping these people from barbecue?
Yes.
So we'll try to make it.
In 4 minutes, you can eat.
Yes. I think our tone is really important because sometimes we can undermine our pro-life arguments by the way we speak. We can do this in a couple of ways. One, let's always remember when we're talking with people, we're talking with people, with whole people. We're not talking with arguments. We're not talking with principles. We're not crushing avatars online like it's a video game or something. We're talking with actual people. And the more we consider the humanity of even the people we disagree with, the more they're likely to listen to our arguments. Number two, I think we have to, even in the way we talk about other people groups, has to be in a way that affirms their dignity, right? So if I'm a pro-life advocate over here affirming the dignity of the preborn life, as I should be, but if I'm over here on Facebook or some other forum denigrating other people groups, immigrants, refugees, elderly people, politicians I don't like, you name it, if I'm dehumanizing them over here in terrible language and making a sort of Darwinian argument that the flourishing of this group of people is an obstacle to the flourishing of people over here, I'm actually undermining my pro-life argument over here, and I lost my moral credibility. So we have to watch that. The way that we argue matters. And people will see through that, right? They'll say, okay, you care about these vulnerable people, but you don't care about these people. And what they will see is you're not doing this because you care about humanity. You're doing this because it's a political thing. And this is the issue for your team. And so I think we just have to constantly be watching that.
Yeah, I tell audiences all the time that it would be hypocritical for me to take an argument to the world that all human beings ought to be treated with dignity and respect, while at the same time hating people who disagree with me. All the human beings ought to be treated with dignity and respect, include the people who disagree with me. And as somebody who was once on the pro-choice side and I was once a pro-choice atheist when I was younger, I know that it's just false that people don't change their minds on this, because I did change my mind on this. I also know the kind of people that had nothing to do with me changing my mind. We were talking at dinner last night, and I was sharing that when I was an atheist, I hated Christians and Christians hated me. We had a mutual relationship going there. I was very hateable, I get that, but here's the thing, building on something I once heard Ravi Zacharias say, I was acting in accordance with the beliefs that I held. They were not acting in accordance with the beliefs that they claimed to hold. When I could frustrate them, and by the way, I did it intentionally, frustrate Christians to the point where they would tell me loudly that they could not wait for me to burn in hell. They were so excited about that for me one day. That was just fuel for me to continue to dislike them. And so when I try to tell people, and also demonstration to me that they didn't fully understand what they claimed to believe, but that was all sport for me. It was a game for me back then. What ultimately changed my mind was when I realized I confronted a good arguer. I always talk about we need good arguments from good arguers. Our job is not to win arguments. Our job is to win people with good arguments. What ultimately got me to consider Christianity, and that ultimately led to me being the person that I am today, was when I had a person in front of me that I genuinely believed all the way through my heart, they cared about me. Despite the fact that I was awful, and I was awful, they cared, they prayed. I didn't bother them. Nothing I said to them affected them, because and I'll tell you why, they were solid in their relationship with Christ. I represented no threat to them whatsoever. And all of my ranting and all of my arguing and all of my accusations, they were just bulletproof to every bit of it. But they also at the same time understood that they wanted me to know Christ. When I argue with people, why do I do what I do? Because people tell me all the time, and I get done like, man, you really care about this. And it's like, I do, but just because I used to be on the other side. And I want other people to have the opportunity to get right like I am. It's much a happier place to be right with God and right with life. And so I want them to have the same opportunity. And so we can't become the reason that they won't listen. You can become the reason. There can be a point in an argument where they have stopped arguing and they're just never going to agree with you because they're just sick of you. I assure you, I've been that guy more times than I would like to be. And so what we have to do is learn to equip ourselves to argue. What happens when you start to talk about something is that your lack of preparation makes you feel stressed, and it introduces all that emotion to the argument. Why I do what I do is because it's my goal. Why he does what he does and the ERLC does what they do is it's our goal to help you when you engage with the culture to feel prepared, to be equipped, so that conversation doesn't make you nervous or angry or let your emotion out, but you're ready to sit across the table from somebody and talk about important issues like this, to make your case for life so that you can change their minds with good arguments.
So naturally, we're only scratching the surface here with this conversation. We really want to encourage you guys to pursue more training, more equipping, more resources. And I would start with the organizations that these guys represent. The Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. Go to erlc.com, merelyhumanministries.org. Human Coalition has something called the Human Element Show, hosted by Brian Fisher, president of Human Coalition. You can find that at the humanelementshow.com or anywhere you get podcasts. So that's all we have for today. Would you guys help me thank these guys for participating in this discussion?
Can I say one thing right before you let it go? Something we were both available for questions. I just give a warning to everybody. I'm a deeply introverted guy, so I'm never going to look like I want you to talk to me. But if you have a question, you got to fight through that and walk up and talk to me, because the only reason I drove here to hang out with y'all is so that I could answer any questions. So if you see me walking around, please come up and talk to me. Don't let the way I look bother you. It's just me. So.
Well, we won't hold you up any longer from barbecue. A few very quick housekeeping elements. Number one, if you got a t-shirt and you did not get a tumbler, they have those available. Make sure you stop by and grab one of those. The other thing is, I believe we're still missing an iPhone. So if you see an iPhone anywhere, find somebody with a Human Coalition shirt on, anyone that looks official, and try to get that in the right hands. Third thing, and most importantly, the barbecue is going to be out here by the baseball field. So if my right, your left, if you go out, and you should be able to find that pretty easily. Thank you guys for coming.